So maybe the budget here is that I don't want to spend more than 40 bucks on all of my groceries. Oh, so maybe we have a friend, Julie, let's say she's a vegetarian, doesn't eat meat, so I need to consider keeping meat off the menu. Maybe Joe has an allergy to peanuts, so it's important that we don't have any nuts or products with nuts come home from the grocery store. Maybe we have Jose, he has some gluten intolerance, so you want to make sure we have some options for Jose as well. And although this event is the start of a fun Friday night, it's probably already filled with constraints that we have to start thinking about. But at first, in the example, any food in the entire world could be on my menu. But then you remember the budget and your choices are already becoming smaller. So like I said, design constraints, they can feel like negative things sometimes, but they are basically here to help shape the project to fit the exact needs of my customer. And of course, in this example here, the result at the end of all of our considerations will be that some meal will suit me and all of my guests. We go to the next one on security or secure by design. Well, security in our design should be considered as far as the requirements allow, or in many cases, even demand. But what does that really mean? Well, we could take some examples, right? We, for example, would probably want to minimize our attack surface area. So the principle of minimizing attack surface area restricts functions that devices on the network are allowed to access, typically to reduce potential vulnerabilities. If you think in Veeam terms, you could use some hardened repository. Once it's set up, you disable SSH, right? That's already a minimized attack surface there, as opposed to something that's available on the network. I think most customers, to a certain degree, use a volume, at least, of default settings. Okay, well, if you think of a job or anything else, oftentimes in Veeam, you'll see a button, Save as Default. Why not make sure that we have secure defaults, right? So the idea here, the principle is that we want secure by default. And this makes basically sure that we have strong security rules, which servers are allowed to be placed on which networks, how close these firewalls should be. If you have service accounts, well, how often do we need to update passwords? How complex should they be? And so on. And if we then think about that service account, of course, we want to operate with the principle of least privilege, right? So the service account user here should have the minimum set of privileges required to perform a specific task. There's no reason to create a service account for Veeam in your vCenter and then assign it full administrator rights, unless what you're looking to do is never have to think about anything regarding permissions, of course. Until that day, someone maybe abused it to do something that it shouldn't. Good news is you have tracking of which user it was. The bad news is it could only do those things because you allowed it to go and do it. Why not follow the actually quite good documentation there is and just only give the service account exactly the permissions that it needs? But when we start applying this, you might have, based on all of your analytics, decided, okay, I'm going to, let's say, use a repository. I've narrowed it down based on requirements to 2 options. Which one is more secure? Boom, then that's the one we're going to pick. Or which one is the more simple one? And that's one we'll go with. Oftentimes, simple and secure, that sounds like deviating things, but I would say when we make complex things, that's actually oftentimes where it is not necessarily so secure as it could have been, or it becomes very difficult to manage, which again is where people oftentimes start cutting corners, which is not really the best, to be frank. If we continue a little bit to flexibility, then what do we have? Well, it's definitely a step-by-step iteration that we're going through here. We've visioned, we've gathered all of these requirements. Now it's maybe time to actually go and create it. And at Veeam, we definitely favor a iterative method of development here, meaning we want flexibility so that we avoid these expensive forklift upgrades, so that we can instead easily scale out without having to do a complete solution redesign. Instead, we make a design where we have building blocks. Maybe you make a proxy building block, you make a repository building block. If you need more storage, boom, you drop in an extra building block. You need to process your backups faster, boom, you plop in an extra proxy building block. And we can keep adding these. We don't have design decisions that are locking us down to some state where the solution can't possibly be expanded in the future. Now, as we go forward, right at the beginning, we've defined some scope. Hopefully, we've done good discovery. We've understood what we need to cover. But then later on, actually, additional parts of the infrastructure does become part of the scope. Maybe we went out and purchased a competitor, and now we need to merge their infrastructure, IT infrastructure, into ours and also protect it, right? So suddenly you have this blunk, big, huge chunk that you also want to protect. Okay, well, do we now do a big redesign? Well, hopefully not, right? We just need to add more building blocks. That's definitely the plan, at least. Lastly, we had the high value, right? It's one of these cost benefits situations. And if we look at the, should I say, definition maybe of cost benefits, it's basically a analysis of pros and cons of some given situation or course of action to determine the downsides compared to the upsides, right? So basically, we're looking to make sure that, for example, this principle holds the cost so that we end up providing a solution that doesn't exceed the utility or benefit to the customer, right? You don't want to spend $10 million protecting something that's 1 million worth, right? That just doesn't make any sense at all. Now, our architect, of course, is going to sum up potential rewards expected from some situation or action, and then subtract total cost associated with taking that action. Sure, it would be nice to store all of your backups on some speedy NVMe storage, right? I would love to do that. But what justification do we have from our requirements and constraints? And sometimes we have other costs that can be maybe tricky to include. It could be indirect costs, including electricity, maybe overhead costs for management of the solution, some intangible costs like impact on my employees or delivery times or things like that. Because maybe you want something, it takes ages to show up. You have to then renew the contract of the existing solution for 1 extra year. Well, then you have a cost right there that maybe weren't really part of the budget. So going a different way might end up being cheaper, or even though the equipment was more expensive than you were initially planned, it's still cheaper than paying for that renewal cost, or whatever it is that we're looking at. These are the sort of overarching design principles, and we want to keep those in mind at every step of the way. If you're ever sitting thinking, well, I have multiple options here, let's take a look at these 4 principles, apply them, and make sure that we use those as a guide for making the final decision on what will we suggest and recommend here. The next step becomes the design methodology, and it's a 6-step methodology here. We essentially start off with discovery, right? We want to figure out what do you have, what's in the scope, who are the stakeholders, and this is no easy process. And I definitely want to make it clear here that when we talk about discovery and we look at this slide here, you might think, well, okay, I do discovery, I'm done, then I go to conceptual. No, it's extremely rare that you can ever say, I'm done with discovery. Because at the beginning of the project, maybe you only have one single stakeholder, right? Clearly someone engaged you in this project, whoever it could be. Then we go and talk to this person. Okay, well, what are the business critical, mission critical applications? What else do you have? We start asking the why questions, right? Who's the owner of that? Oh, so this is someone who's a stakeholder. Gonna put that down on the list. Then we have questions for that person. And so the more we ask, typically the more we find out. At some point, hopefully we've gotten almost everything, or ideally everything that we need. But then we want to make sure that we have the right information. So then we maybe narrow the questions down a little bit more to be maybe more specific. And eventually it basically becomes closed questions. I understand that you have dot, 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 and you want to do so and so. Is that correct? Yes. Or no. Okay, well then we need to have a conversation to find out where did this go wrong. And don't forget about competing stakeholders who might have different opinions on what do they want to do, and retention, and how things should be done, and so on. Very common situation. Well, then at some point you'll have to figure out whose budget are we spending, and probably that's the person who will be making the final call on some of those decisions, to be frank. But discovery is something that could take a long time, and you'll come back to it. Then we have the conceptual part. This is basically where we try to take all of that big chunk, at least initially, a big chunk of information from discovery. We start making tables, documentation, what are identified requirements, identified constraints. Maybe there's information that we realized we haven't been able to get. Maybe they don't know what their change rate is. Maybe that's an assumption. Just keep in mind, assumptions, you want to eliminate them. Assumptions are basically best effort guesses that we're trying to do here. And we don't want to do a design based on my guess. Maybe I make good guesses and, fantastic. But what about those times when I turned out to be wrong, right? Surely over time, that will happen at least once. So what we then do, of course, is to go back to the customer and say, hey, I need to get this information. Sometimes they'll say, well, we just don't know. We just can't possibly give you this information. We don't know. We have no way of getting it. Okay, well, then you basically have to say, okay, I need this as a variable in the calculations that I'll be doing as a part of your design. Can we agree on an assumption based on my experience that we'll use a value of 15% or whatever it is? Then we document that. We can't get the information. It becomes an assumption. If we get the information, it's no longer an assumption. It's confirmed data. Assumptions should be unconfirmed data, basically. We move through all of this. Once we've built all of this, it's a good idea to kind of make a high-level diagram. And sometimes people, they get all excited. Oh, yes, now to make something pretty here. There's no reason to deep dive. You don't want to put like 1,000 VM stencils. Oh, then we are protecting these VMs over here. There's 1,000 of those, 10 clusters. No. Let's make a diagram. It's like, okay, we have virtual machines here. That's already more than enough information. We have maybe some physical workloads. Maybe I have something else that needs to be protected, like a database specifically. Maybe it's an Oracle or SQL. If there's like specific named applications that you really want to call out, you can put them there. Next up, we might have multiple locations. Well, you have to get a VM backup server. So if you already know where it could make sense to put it, you can put it there. But what about these backups? You probably, based on those requirements, have identified that in that location, we need to have a backup. And then I need to make a copy to that other location. And then people are like, oh, okay, they use public cloud. It's Azure, it's Google Cloud, it's AWS, whatever, service provider, Cloud Connect. So I'm going to write Cloud Connect. No, you didn't make that decision yet, right? Just write cloud and then put the backup there. Right? You don't have to decide that it's going to object storage or cloud repository or something like that. It's just a backup will go to that location. And this is as high level as we need to keep it. That's all perfectly fine. Later, when we get to the next section, go to logical. Now we'll start to make actual decisions. Will I use object storage? Okay, great. So I've decided that I will use that. Well, now I also know that, for example, I need a scale-out backup repository, just as an example. Maybe you have some requirement for immutability. Okay, so then maybe it becomes cloud, maybe it becomes hardened. It depends a little bit here. It could also be you end up with tape, right? So there's so many options, but now we have to start making decisions. Let's say you want to use block storage. Customer has some budget constraint here. They want to spend the minimal amount. Okay, so that means we have to think in how can I avoid storing more data than I have to. It has to match exactly to the requirements. Maybe you want to use ReFS, XFS, or something like that. We have to write something like down. I need block cloning, fast cloning on this repository. Just to give you ideas. But now that we've made those decisions in the logical phase, I can continue logical to size every single component. How much bandwidth do I need to send it offsite? Well, I don't know, because I didn't yet calculate how much the backups are going to be. And because I didn't do that, I don't know how big these incrementals are going to be. I need that to size the bandwidth. So it makes sense to have a defined order of what are we going to do here. And in the training, of course, we give you all of that information as well, a little cliffhanger. Yeah, but starting off with those backups, probably not a bad place to start. Now, once we've gone through component by component, based on the features and corresponding components that we want to use, then we can go and size those relevant components. At the end, now let's say I've decided I needed 100 proxy cores. Well, now it's time to make a physical design. And here I have to think about things like, well, are we going to combine certain roles? Like, should I put my repository and the proxy on one box? Well, maybe the answer is easy, because if, let's say, you decided earlier that you were going to use a hardened repository, well, then we should know the answer is already no, because they can be co-located. So now you have to split them. What if you didn't do that? Well, then maybe you decide to put them on the same. Maybe you decide to split them anyway. But we have to make some decisions here on that. And then, of course, we start looking at things like, well, how much storage did I need in total? Well, how much can I realistically put into one box? Okay, well, then that becomes my building block. How much CPU does each building block get? Memory. And then I already can start to say I need so and so many building blocks. So repository, proxy, and so on. And then we get to the implementation governance part. Well, here you have to start thinking, were there certain settings? Because sometimes people get confused about design and implementation. But let's say there was a requirement when you send your backups to public cloud object storage that the traffic had to be encrypted. Okay, well, the traffic is encrypted by default, so no problem. But what if they said the backups there had to be stored encrypted? Ooh, if there was no requirement to store them encrypted on-prem, then obviously I'm not going to do that, because that's extra performance load. You could decide to do it anyway, secure by design, that's fine. But if you decided to do on-prem encryption, then you don't want to put the checkbox to make sure that they get encrypted a second time when you send them out. But if you didn't store them on-prem encrypted, then you have to check that box to make sure that you meet the requirement. But that wasn't a design decision that we're making here. That was a requirement that then leads down to the implementation team. They have to remember to go and put this, and they might forget about it. So we would definitely want that one small detail among many, many potential other pieces of decisions to be a part of that handoff. Who's responsible for what? Yeah, this needs to be very, very clear. Then we have this validation, iteration. Like I said, we've now done the implementation. Are we meeting our backup windows? Are we having errors? Do we have a new scope that's been adjusted? Do we need to do a new iteration? Well, then we go back to discovery. We can run through the whole cycle one more time. So it's a process that seems never ending, but when do you come back for this validation and iteration? You got to give these people a little bit of time. It has to have a chance to run for some time, maybe 3-6 months down the line. Depends a little bit on how long do we need for equipment to show up, all the stuff like that. You might be thinking, all right, this sounds fantastic. Yeah, I would love to sit on this training. Well, I'm happy to hear that you've been excited about that. How did I then become certified? Well, there is a exam, as always. Yeah. Now, before I dive into the details of the exam itself, just in case someone didn't know it, all of the VIM exams are taken through Pearson VUG, which you may have used to take exams from other vendors. Now, a little bit depending on how those vendors work, you may have been able to go down to your local test center and they just looked you up in the system and they booked it for you immediately. With VIM, you can't technically take the exam before you've been authorized. Now, to get authorized, it's actually a two-step process. Step one is take the training. We talked about that. Step two, you go to the VIM website, vim.com/vmce. You log in using the email that you used when you signed up for the training. You click VIM certifications, the VMCA tab, and then there's going to be under the schedule your exam tab, a exam, manage your exam button. And when you click that, this is what the first time, this is when the VIM system sends that authorization over to Pearson VUG. It's the same for the VMC exam. Now, maybe that sounds complicated. It's literally like 3 clicks. Now, once that's been done, you can schedule it online, you can call Pearson VUG, you can talk to your local test center, everything is fine. Every now and then I talk to someone and they're kind of confused why they can't do it. They just need to go and press the button. That's usually what it is. Of course, there's different situations. Maybe the education center forgot to report your class for some reason. Okay, that can happen, but thankfully that's a very, very minimal thing here. Okay, so on this exam itself, who is it that can go and sit this? Well, obviously the course you could go and attend this architecture and design course, but could someone else also do it? Well, in the past we had a course called VIM Certified Engineer Advanced Design and Optimization. If you took that course in the previous 12 months or so, then it's also possible to go and schedule the new exam. You could potentially do the old one, but it's going to go end of life. So you might want to do the new one instead. Or if you've taken the old course, passed the old exam, you are VIM Certified Architect version 1, then of course we also let you upgrade. No problem at all. Once you sit the exam, what should we expect here? Well, it's nothing overly difficult. You may have heard about old exams where we had endless amounts of math and formulas and stuff to memorize. We don't have that on the new exam. What you'll be presented with, identical to the old one, is 40 different questions. We give you 90 minutes. However, a time extension of 30 minutes is offered if the exam is delivered in a language different than the local language. That's a complicated way to say if you are in a country where the local language is not English, you will get a 30-minute extension because the exam is only available as of right now, at least in English. Who knows, maybe it will be localized in the future. What do you need to pass the exam? You need a score of 70%, ideally better, right? 70% means there was 30% that we missed opportunity, right? Now, the exam gives you a case study, and there are multiple case studies in the system. So should the unfortunate thing happen that you fail, don't be discouraged about that, but please also don't be surprised that you will get a completely different case study when you take it the next time. So trying to memorize information from the exam is basically useless. Rather, go back, look at the process, try to understand what was it that I somehow misunderstood in identifying all of this information, and then apply that to the new case study. The case study is basically going to be your friend throughout the entire exam. Every single question that you get, the answer you pick as the correct one must be related to that case study. Okay, the questions themselves are typically not very difficult if they were standalone. But because you have to apply them to the case study, you have to understand and process all of that information that they have. On the exam itself, there are different sections. I've listed them out here. We have discovery, 25% of the exam, conceptual design, also 25%, logical design, 25%, and then we have physical tangible, 15%, deployment and evaluation, 10%. So you can see there's a pretty good overlap here with the course. All of the content that you will be tested on will be from this course or the regular configuration and management training. So if you're a Veeam certified engineer, you only need to worry about the new content here. Now, one important thing to know is during the exam, you get the case study, but there are also 5 different tabs. I didn't list them out on the slide, but I'm going to tell you. The first one is a executive overview, basically sort of a summary of what infrastructure, issues, requirements do they have. Second tab, solution concept, high-level description of Veeam's proposed solution. Tab number 3, existing technical environment before anything Veeam. So basically some specification of what they have. Then we take a look at the existing technical environment. So what does that look like from a technical perspective? We look at business requirements and finally technical requirements that they might have. Now, what is very near and dear to my heart is doing the best I can to help people prepare and ideally pass the exam the first time. Everyone is able to pass this exam, and it's also definitely doable to do it in the first attempt, but some study needs to be invested. And I can say I've already been contacted by more than one person. This exam went live, I think, August 2nd, 2021. And I've already been contacted by more than one person who told me that not until almost the very end of the exam did they realize there were multiple tabs with information. This is pretty clear in the system, but regardless, even if somehow you're stressing, you felt it wasn't clear, it's also described in the exam guide document, right? Important thing is, don't be surprised, know what you're going into. To me, I think they didn't read the exam guide, and that's a big miss because this is the document that tells you what should you expect to be tested on. If you don't know what to be tested on, you're basically going in blind, hoping to wing it, essentially. And that's maybe not the best start point to pass a certification exam. Another good tip I can give you on the exam is that questions do not relate to each other. Let me make a fake example here. This is not something from the real exam. I want to make that absolutely clear up front. So it's maybe not even slightly, maybe very exaggerated, but I just want to make what I'm talking about abundantly clear here. So let's say you have a case study and it tells you that the customer wants 14 days of retention. So you're like, okay, boom, 2 weeks of retention, done. You then are presented with some question that states the customer has changed their mind and the retention requirement is now 7 days. And the actual question then asks you something about how this is affecting sizing. Okay, no problem. You understand, you reply, great. 3 questions later, you're plowing through everything is going great. You get a question and now you're confused because the next question says, how much retention does the customer want? And your answer options are 7 days, 14 days, 21 days, 31 days. Now it's very tempting to answer 7 days because you just learned from the other question that they changed their mind. They changed what's in the case study. 7 days would be the wrong answer because in the exam guide, we are very clearly told questions do not relate to each other. You should always go up to the case study to find the correct information. Now, like I said, just to be completely clear, I'm making a very big deal about this in this clear example here. Veeam is not trying to trick you on the exam somehow, right? I just made this over-the-top example to try and get the point across here. That definitely, there's no intention of anything like that. So that's why I said it's a fake example, but I think most people can understand the point here. It's listed as like one line in the exam guide, but I think most people, they don't really know what to expect from that piece of information. Now I'm thinking, what else could I tell you? So is there something else that you need to know? Yes. Now, you don't have to be experts here. In the guide, it says some technologies are not specifically taught in any of the trainings. They still expect candidates to have some familiarity with them for contextual reasons. Well, Oracle would be on what is RMAN, what is clustering, Microsoft SQL Server, because we don't teach you about these specific technologies in any of the trainings, but we expect you to have an idea that RMAN is Oracle's recovery manager tool that is sort of the official tool to do backups and recovery, and maybe even know that Veeam has a plugin for that. You don't need to know anything about the plugin per se, but like I said, for contextual reasons, if we talk about Oracle RMAN, we don't want someone to sit there thinking, well, to tell you, never heard about that before. I didn't realize I was supposed to look up what RMAN means or what is Oracle clustering. So now you know, and you should have known before you went into the exam. I didn't prepare too much more content because I also wanted to make sure that in case some people had questions, that they had a chance to go and ask them. And I also know, put it in the chat, there's a little survey there. So it's definitely very important here that we go and take a look. But if there are some questions, I would absolutely love to hear you.
Feel free to unmute yourselves, guys, and ask
Absolutely.
Rasmus anything.
Anything, Chris. You sold me out here. But okay, I'll do the best.
Anything related to the content presented today.
Oh.
There we go.
we just narrowed the scope significantly.
I've got a question to go off and break the ice. So yeah, I remember the first Architect exam, and I remember that we took the course in New Orleans, and they said, we're going to give you one free try now, and you'll have another free try later. And we all kind of laughed because we're all superstars and all this. And then he laughed at us, and then we got destroyed. I mean, everyone except for one guy who we almost beat up passed it because it was very, very difficult. And then I heard later on from other people saying it was really, really difficult. And then later, apparently something changed a bit. So I'm not asking you how hard it is, obviously, because that wouldn't be correct. But I'm asking you, because this is, Canada, I'm working with whatever. What do you think? Is it really hard or not?
Well, I mean, obviously, I carry a certain bias here. I think it's not a very difficult exam. I think the difficulty level is significantly lower than the old exam, because there you were expected to memorize a ton of math and formulas and things, and that's just very difficult for some people, including myself, right? Unless I'm using it on a very constant basis, then it's sort of top of mind. I wouldn't recommend anyone, old course, old exam, new course, new exam, to sit the training, let's say Tuesday, Wednesday, and then schedule the exam for Thursday. That's always a bit of a rough move, I would say. If you're doing this every single day, you maybe just needed the course as a checkbox, but I wouldn't suggest doing that. I think the trick here is to keep in mind the questions are pretty specific. We put a lot of effort into reviewing them to make sure that there are clear, correct answers, some that are also correct, but once you go up to this case study, they will no longer be correct. And that's the key to remember. You have to relate it to different tabs. We all have different strategies. Some people, they'll sit down and spend the first half an hour reading all of the information. And if that's what works for you the best, go for it. Personally, I'm not a big fan of doing that because I feel a lot of time is, I don't want to say wasted, but what usually happens is when you're done, how much can you really remember? And so when you get a question, if you immediately find yourself having to go back, probably time would have been spent better to maybe read that executive summary, go down to the questions, and then when you get asked about something specific, then go up, take some notes, because in Pearson you get like the plastic thing you can write on. If it's an online exam, they give you a digital scratch pad that you're allowed to use, and there are no math questions. So I think from that perspective, it's a different type of exam. Is it easy? No. Is it easy than the old one? Yes, I definitely think so. Also much more fair. That was a bit of a rant, so sorry about that. But great question, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I think your wrath, the math is what was scary. I got one other side question too, just because you mentioned when the extra 30 minutes, that's depending on the language of your country, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so we're lucky in Canada because we've got 2 official languages, so we get the 30 minutes no matter what, right?
I think I'll let you debate that out with Pearson VUG and see. I guess it might depend on which
Any
area.
way I can sneak in, you know?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, like I'm in Denmark, so I always enjoy these time extensions because we should have subtitled this thing, right? Clearly, you can only half understand what I'm saying because my English level is so low here. But
That's perfect. Come on.
hopefully it worked out okay.
That thing with all the northern countries, people always say, "Oh, I don't speak much English," and they speak it better than me.
Well, yeah, that's always a little bit scary, but definitely from a little minority language here. We're only about 5 million people in Denmark, so it's a small group. Well, don't be shy, guys. Feel free to ask. You can also put it in the chat, or you can send a private message with the question if you don't want to somehow. Some people are worried about losing face in the user group in front of other people. Don't be worried about that. I'd rather just drop it in.
No one's here. No one here will judge.
We'll only judge about the questions you don't ask. That's the thing.
Erasmus, what's the renewal process look like? Has that changed any with the 2022?
So you mean, let's say you took the 2022 and now it's 2023?
Correct.
I don't know. I think that's probably to be determined as we go forward a little bit. It was I wouldn't even call it a revamp. It was a bulldoze and build something new here. So we'll have to see what they do moving forward. Unfortunately, I just don't know, Jim. I'd love to give you a good answer here, but it's just unknown to me.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Yeah, forget about the survey. We love to hear from you, right? What can we? Yep. What did you like? What do you want more of? But also, what can we do better? Maybe some topics you would like to hear from. I mean, as someone who's run a user group in the past, from the beginning, you might have a million good ideas, but the larger the pool of ideas, the more likely it is we can find the very good ones.
Yeah, sorry if everybody's seen this a few times, but each time somebody joins, they don't see it. So
yeah, that's the thing.
Have to keep sending it again and again.
All right. Well, it seems we've tried up the questions, Chris, and I think it looks like I spent pretty much 1 hour, including the questions. So I think I managed to keep you on time here.
Not a problem.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll definitely have you back again for sure. maybe in 2023 to answer some more questions about the new stuff when it comes.
It will be like hey, it's time to renew. What's the process?
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks again so much for having me. True pleasure, and enjoy the rest of the presentations.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rasmus. Take it easy.
All right. If you want to share your screen, Jeff, go ahead.
Yep. 1 second.
So we'll do a little bit of talking about hardened repos, and if we have time left over, we'll talk about some of the new VMware vCloud enhancements in version 11. So
just give me 1 second. Yeah, I was gonna ask like 15 more questions, but then I think we didn't want to overdo the welcome there. But anyways, let me just get organized here. So this is the first time that I think Chris too is we're doing a
Yep.
Veeam user group.
Yep.
So, you know, and this is the first time I've ever done a online thing. So, you know, normally when I do anything like this, I'm in a room and people all have a beer and I wait till I've had about 5 and then I can just say whatever I want and they're happy. But now everyone seems to have cups of coffee, so it's especially nerve-wracking. Okay, so what Chris I wanted to do was to more than actually coming after Erasmus, we can't even compare as far as our technical knowledge and
Nope.
our presentation ability. So, but what we want to do is kind of have a kind of overview of the topics we want to talk about briefly, and then a discussion possibly, because obviously everyone here, it seems some of the people here, I see their names, are big professionals. And so the user groups, at least in the past that I've attended, which were live user groups, people would actually intermingle and talk and whatnot. So not very formal. That was kind of the point of it. And of course, no salespeople too. That was the other big rule. So if you're a salesperson, we have to kick you out. Okay, so I was just going to quickly describe hardened repositories because they're new. They've just come in Veeam 11, and why they're important. I think all of us who work in IT can think of one big reason: ransomware. And ransomware is very powerful. I know that both Chris and I, and Hin, who's on this call as well, have actually seen customers lose their backups because of ransomware. The ransomware was Veeam Smart. It would go in and wipe out a customer's local appliance, and then would go through the APIs and delete the backups on the Cloud Connect, because we're a Cloud Connect provider. So Veeam realized this was a problem and started a few years ago with insider protection, which not fully only geared against ransomware. That was the name insider protection means they're protecting it someone's in the inside, which bad guy IT people like me or you or whatever. I think someone said it, the rogue IT administrator. So somebody who's been underpaid and gets angry and deletes everything. That's kind of the insider protection. But at the same time, it protects against ransomware. However, that also has weaknesses. And I think it was actually Rasmus who described one of them, whereby you reduce, if you're the hacker and you've gotten inside someone's network, you reduce the retention to 1, and then you encrypt the last backup, something of that nature. And so then the last backup that gets deleted that goes into the recycle bin, which is an insider protection, is encrypted. And there's other various ways. So obviously something was needed that was better. And when Veeam introduced Linux repositories, this opened up a whole new area of tools that they could leverage, which didn't exist in Windows systems. And so a hardened repository is basically Veeam is using 2 things in Linux. One is a single-use credentials, and the other is mutability. So single-use credentials are important because in the past, when we added Linux repositories, you might remember there was a, put in your username, whatever, and then you sudo or elevate privileges, and you just leave it in there. And there's 2 potential problems with that. The first problem is that the credentials are being kept in the Veeam database. And as I understand it, that's using the machines, it's using Microsoft APIs, which are very good to encrypt, but it's using the machine key apparently. So what that means, if someone good who knows what they're doing gets into your Veeam server, they can get all these passwords. So that's one problem. The second problem is that all software has vulnerabilities, and Secure Shell does as well. There was a few years ago, OpenSSL had a really bad one, and everyone started patching really quickly. So it's not perfect. Obviously, it takes someone pretty skilled to do these things, but so I don't know if script kiddies have thought of this yet, but obviously they are security holes. So with single-use credentials, the idea behind it is quite simple. You use a Secure Shell connection initially to connect to your Veeam repository on Linux. You install your components, and then it goes away. It's never needed again. Going forward after that, the communication between components is done with certificates only. So it's much more secure. And there's no need for that secure shell. I mean, VMware experts here will know that in vSphere, they always say disable the secure shell, only enable it for troubleshooting, right? So similar concept. Everyone knows you shouldn't keep it enabled. So so that's why you want the secure shell. Now, the second part, immutability, is something that's actually been around in Linux for a long time. It's just an attribute, a file attribute. And I'll actually show it to you, not Veeam related, just to show what it is. And basically what that does is once Veeam sets it, it can't be removed, only by the root user. And the trick here is that when Veeam leverages these Linux repositories, it creates two service accounts, basically. One is the regular transport service, I think it's called, can't remember off the top of my head, I think it's the transport service. That is running as a non-root user. So that's just moving stuff back and forth, non-root user. But then it creates this new one, which I have the name for here somewhere. It's called the Veeam Immune Repo SVC. So it kind of gives it away. And that service, its only job is to set the attribute or remove the attribute. That's it. And that does have root access. So they've cleverly separated this. And that's what allows them to not give the Veeam transport service those kind of access. Now, as you realize, in a Windows system, that's much more difficult because even now, for instance, it's been a bit of pet peeve for many of us, to use the VBR server, I believe still in 11, you need to have administrator access, if I'm not wrong. I think they've promised to stop that soon, but it's hard to harden something if everyone who's logging into the console is an administrator, just from that standpoint. So this is a good example of how they've gotten around that in Linux. Obviously, there's an important piece to this Linux repository, which needs to be known as well, is that if you're going to leverage this, you really want to use XFS and reflinks, which will allow you to use fast clone. Fast clone, many of you will know from Windows, came with REFS3 in 2016. It basically uses pointers. I'm not a developer, so I don't know the deep parts, but it's using pointers. So instead of recreating a whole new full, when you do a synthetic backup on a weekend or something, it just, boom, quickly spits it out. The reason why we want to use fast clone here is because if your backup files are immutable, you can't do any synthetic operations on them. They're immutable. So you're talking, you have to do forever incrementals with periodic active fulls or synthetic fulls, because it can't get out, but it can't change the actual file. So that's one thing to keep in mind. I don't know if anyone would be setting up XFS repositories without reflink now, but maybe they still did. Okay, so I'll just share my screen quickly and show a very quick demo of what this is. 1 second. And it's very simple. This stuff is, it's not going to share the right screen. I'll show my salary. Don't want to do that one. Okay, there we go. Tell me if you can see that, Chris. Can you see it? You see that? Oh, good. Okay.
Nope.
Okay, so this is a Linux little machine I've got. Which actually is a node in Kubernetes, but I won't go there. That's for the future. And I created a little folder, and in that folder, where am I? I'm in the wrong folder. Oh, there it is. Okay, VMUG. Okay, and I got a little file there called Jeff text, and I can just see what's in there. It says Jeff file hello. Wow. What Veeam is leveraging in Linux is something, the two commands basically. One's called the chatter, and the other one's the ls attribute. And chatter is to change attribute, and the ls is to list. So this file right now, I will prove to you that it is mutable, because I will go in there and I will type hello Rasmus, just for that, if I can type. Okay, save that. We'll cat it. There it is. Hello Rasmus. Okay, so if we want to make this mutable, first of all, I can't do it as my little user account, so I'm going to have to become root. Okay, and then I'll have to go back to where I was. Oops. Because only root can do this. And so we're back in that folder. So now I'm going to change the attribute. And it's very simple. It's either a plus or a minus. So I'm going to put plus I, immutable, and then my file. And now if we do an ls attr on this file, we see the I right around the middle. In fact, if you want it to be even prettier, you can just type this and it'll actually say it. Jeff text immutable. Okay, so what does that mean? It means it's immutable, which means that if I now try to go in, even as root, you will see here that the user is root. So that is God in the Unix Linux world. I can type, oh, what does it say? Warning, you're changing a read-only file. Okay, well, many of you Linux people will know, yeah, I don't care. I'm just going to force it. I'm going to put W and then exclamation mark, and normally that'll jam it down its throat. Boom. Can't do it. Can't open it. So even root cannot change this file. So that's pretty good. The problem, though, is that root can change the immutability. So hardened repositories are still only as hard if no one can get on the console, right? So we've taken away the secure shell. They can't get in that way. But if your console's not physically protected, someone can walk up and they know the password and they get in as root, then all they have to do is this. And we're going to minus the I on the Jeff file. And now change, my spelling's an issue this morning. Well, it's not morning, it's afternoon. Change file. And that now worked. Change file. So important things to remember. Linux is, or Veeam is doing the same thing basically. It's going in there, that service, that extra service is going in there. It's setting the immutability file, attribute and leaving it. And then nothing can change it but that service, which will go in again with root access. Now, Veeam asks, the question you might be asking, okay, that's great, but how then does it interpret this immutable until? Because obviously, since this is all done on the Linux server, it's got nothing to do with the Linux or the Veeam database. I mean, the database might record that, but somewhere it's got to be set here. So that's a bit deeper, and this is where Veeam have come in and done their own stuff. And I didn't want to go into it today because it's very deep, but what I do have is there's a fellow who Chris knows very well in, I think he's in the Netherlands. He's another Veeam Vanguard, and he has a great description of this. And I thought it would just, me trying to do the same thing wouldn't work. But what I decided to do was to share it with you guys, and I'll give you the link. His name's Didier Van Hoey, if I'm pronouncing that correctly or not. Jim Jones would know him too, because they're both, Chris and Jim are both Vanguards. But he has gone and done a great in-depth look at this in 3 parts, 2 no less. And he's actually went in and did a deep dive and found what Veeam is doing and where Veeam lists its immutability. So first he goes into setting up an account, or how to do all this. He talks about the service, but he also later goes and finds where Veeam have actually set immutable till. I think it's in part 2, but it's a great read. And this is the extra, which is not, this is where Veeam have come in and done this. I'll just show you that part. It's probably in part 3. 1 second. I did read this. Okay, yeah, this is it. So here he's talking about, again, the SLS attribute and the immutable part that I just showed you. But he also went and looked at the part where it actually says immutable until. There we go, immutable. So right after the VIB file, so it actually lists it. So that's pretty cool. Again, you don't really need to know that, but it's good to know what Veeam is actually doing. And so I really recommend that. I'll put the first one in the chat. Okay. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. A brief overview. I don't know how many people have already started leveraging these because they're pretty new. From what I've heard, I think that Veeam are going to start leveraging more and more Linuxy aspects, because one of my personal questions to Veeam are always, well, why can't you make the Veeam console and put that on a Linux server? So we'll see. Maybe that'll come in future, maybe it won't, or a cloud gateway for service providers. But anyways, so that's my part. If anyone has any questions, Chris will answer them.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, if you don't mind me chiming in for like a hot second.
No problem.
Yeah, so a couple things. So in the chat, I posted a link to Tim DeWinn's GitHub.
Oh,
So
yep.
the hardened repository um, is a really great feature in V11. And as you mentioned, Jeff, it's made up of actually a few different technologies that they're just kind of lumping under one big marketing name.
Mhm.
But I will tell you, so full disclosure, so I'm a cloud architect for iLand. So I move about as much data as Chris and Jeff do here at ThinkOn. So we have to think about things at scale. And one of the sneaky best features in V11 is what actually is the glue that makes all this come together, which is historically when you had a Linux repository, all of the transport from your proxies or from your cloud gateways to the repositories was all done directly over SSH. So if you needed to move data from your backup proxy to your repository, the proxy would actually create an SSH session, then start streaming the Veeam agent through that SSH tunnel to get there. Well, that's great as long as you're small, but when you're big, SSH tends to implode. So with V11, part of this wonderfulness is they created the transport service that we all know and love for Windows for Linux. So where that comes into play for this is as we talk about the single use credentials, those it's never stored by Veeam. There's no credentials ever actually used to move data. All you have to do is have credentials to install the service. Now, as a gotcha for you guys is you go to do patches or you go to do upgrades, you're going to have to know those credentials and put them back in each time. But this GitHub repository, this utility that was just shown. So what it actually does is you take a vanilla Ubuntu 2004 is what they use to test, but it'll work with just about anything that's Debian based. You take a vanilla VM and it'll actually go through, set up the service account for you, set the correct permissions, format the volume for you that you're going to use for your repository, leave the SSH connection open just long enough for you to actually install the service, and then it kills the SSH service on the back end. So that threat vector goes away altogether, which is pretty darn cool.
Yeah. No, that's, yeah. And I was going to say too, and I don't know if it's linked with it. Do you know if by default now the agent is persistent? Because I had a problem before that you'd have to actually do I think it was a registry. No, it was registry change on the Veeam server to keep the agent persistent. Because when you're doing massive amounts, that agent being injected constantly was a huge drain.
Yeah. So the persistent agent still isn't by default. It's still a reg key. But that's, to me, that's an okay kind of thing. Persistent agent is one of those things, guys. I mean, so if you guys are like me and have a history of being an SMB and maybe live in that M of the SMB space, persistent agent probably isn't anything you're ever going to want to care about. And honestly, it can be detrimental depending on the situation. It's really at that extreme high end, both security and throughput wise, that you really, really want to consider it. But yeah, it is absolutely key. It's documented. I don't have the KB article right offhand right now, but there is one out there. If you just search for Veeam persistent agent. One last thing I wanted to add about the immutability, Jeff, and I don't know if you know this. I just happened to catch it in a conversation, but immutability for Linux repositories is wildly different than immutability for object and how it works.
Oh, wow.
And in a good way, especially if you're looking to leverage a service provider for like your offsite backups and things like that. So if we look at immutability with say AWS S3, those backups are going to go and it's just going to be at time of write. So if I say I'm going to protect this bucket, I want those backups to be protected for 14 days. When a block finishes getting written, that starts a 14-day clock. And at the end of that 14-day clock, everything, that file is then not immutable anymore. That is 100% the logic. With Linux-based immutability, they put further logic on top of it. So that's the case for your regular blocks. But in the case with the new GFS logic that Veeam brought in with V11, when you start shipping or sending GFS restore points to a mutable repository, those GFS restore points will be immutable for the entire lifespan of that GFS restore point.
That's excellent.
So
Veeam,
if you're
translates that, in other words, it knows that it wants the immutability to that point in time. And even if you've got 14 days, oh, that's excellent. So that's much better. That you're right. That is not present on the object storage for certain.
Yeah, and it actually fixes the problem of doing immutability at a service provider level as well, because or any situation where you're doing backup, excuse me, it fixes the problem of doing immutability with backup copy jobs, period. Because you had the problem because you were doing forever forward. You had to have your tongue held just right so that you had the immutability window fit incorrectly. Well, with V11, GFS restore points are now in line with the backup chain. So they're immutable. They can't be messed with something. But if you actually look at your list of files and you go to do a restore point, rather than having this one chain that's say 32 days with one VBK 32 days ago and all the rollups, you would have that chain and then you have all the GFS restore points. And if I needed to restore to last night, it would go to the latest GFS restore point and then just have the incrementals coming from then.
Oh,
so it's actually going to make your recoverability faster as well, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, that's excellent. Plus, I was going to add to the explain factor is another. I mean, this is purely service provider talk, but trying to explain insider protection on S3 worm, you'd see customers just going, whereas this, it's saying, hey man, it's a Linux repository. You know anything about Linux? No. Well, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, object is great and object has its place, and it absolutely has its place within the Veeam world. But it's one of those things, man, you've got to understand that technology at a pretty high level. It's super easy to consume from I want to ship my backups there. It is infinitely harder and far more complex if you actually have a scenario where you actually have to recover from those.
Yeah.
That's not as intuitive. And if you are looking to use that in your disaster recovery strategy, I would highly recommend that you at least do 3 or 4 passes of some backup testing with those backups and create a good and well-documented run book so you know what you're doing with it. Because as someone who's been there where you have to fix things when you're under fire, man, that run book will save your life.
Yeah.
Definitely.
When someone's shouting, fix it now, I'm paying for this.
Yeah, man. All right. So now that I've taken over a little bit.
Oh, hey, that's fantastic. That's why we invite you people here, because it helps us.
All right. So let's move on. Here we go. I'm just going to share this. So I just put together a slide. I just wanted to talk about some of the newer features for VMware and vCloud that version 11 introduced. It's just bullet points. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not going to go into extreme detail. You can find all of these in the What's New guide for version 11 and stuff like that. But when it comes to VMware, there's a few things that they've enhanced, like I don't know if anybody uses vCert tags. We use those here. I find them much better to use than randomly selecting VMs in a job and having to, oh, now this one's come in. Okay, this one has to go into this job or whatever. You just tag it to whatever tags you have. We have tons of categories. We create one group called backups and then a bunch of tags underneath it. And we assign those to VMs to do backups for our management stacks and things like that. So now if you pick multiple tags in Veeam 11, it uses the AND operator. So if you had infrastructure and then say SQL assigned to it, it'll say, okay, if this VM has infrastructure and SQL tags and both, it'll do the backup for you and things like that. So it's something if you want to investigate and look at. vSphere tags just overall are a better proposition for when it comes to doing backups. It just makes things much easier. The next couple points have to do with the Linux proxy that they've introduced. The one thing I like now is transport modes. They do all of the modes now that the Windows proxies do. So you can do hot add, you can do direct SAN. There's caveats to each of them that you need to follow before they will work that way. But it's nice to see that they've introduced Linux proxies to be able to do this. So it'll save costs on things like Windows licenses. You don't have to license Windows servers just to deploy a proxy to do your backups and things like that. And also they've implemented change block tracking restore. So when you do a full VM restore or a failback to the original location, it will actually use CBT now with the Linux proxy to do the actual restores when you select that option. NBD, network backup, now has multi-threading. So I'm pretty sure before it was a single stream type process, but now with version 11, they've implemented some fixes and some new enhancements to it to be multi-threaded. And then, as everybody knows, when Veeam backs up from VMware, it uses the VDDK, and they've updated that to the most recent version, which is 6.7.3 now. I'm sure at some point down the line, that'll probably change again. This correlates, I believe, to VMware 6.7, so I'm sure we'll see a 7.0 and a 7.x at some point down the line. So, and then we move on to vCloud. So there hasn't been a lot of enhancements to vCloud throughout the versions, and then in this version, they've kind of implemented some more robust features. The first one's vCloud Director replication. So you can set up, it's a lot with service providers. You can have it set up so that your clients can do a direct replication job into a tenant within vCloud. It basically will bypass vSphere, let you go right into the vApps and all that they have set up. We don't implement this yet where we are. I don't know if you've used it yet or not, Jim, but we're working to hopefully soon implement this as well. It's going to be a bit of a game changer for us if we can get it working and going. I just need to find the time to test it, as they say. The next thing on the list is now they have a native vCloud Director plugin. So you can install this plugin into vCloud, and your tenants can actually manage their own backups and things like that. So they can go in, if they added a new VM or spun up a new VM, they can say, okay, add this into this job here, and it will back up their VM for them. Another nice feature that helps enhance service offerings, especially for MSPs and things like that. We haven't implemented this plugin just yet, so I'm talking about all these things. We haven't gotten to them yet, but eventually we will get there. There's also multi vCloud server support, so you can connect more than one vCloud server to your backup server. This way you can, if you have two data centers that have vCloud in them, you can hook both of them up to one VBR server, and then you can do geolocation for, say, some clients, they're going to go to DC1, and then these other clients are going to go to DC2 when you set them up as a tenant in your vCloud and things like that. And when you set them up in Veeam, you can say, okay, you're going to go to this vCloud server and you are going to go over to this vCloud server. And then one of the last things that they added was vCloud 10.2 support. We're actually in the process of upgrading all of our vClouds to 10.2. So it's we're getting there, but hopefully once we get to 10.2, we'll be able to leverage a lot of the stuff in Veeam V11 and everything. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. discussions, anything like that. I've put the survey in the chat multiple times. It's also in my presentation here, just to make sure everybody could see it. So
I know, Chris, maybe if, since this is a user group meeting and, you know, in-person ones, we'd all kind of say hello to each other. I don't know if people want to, if you want to, you can just introduce yourself and, you know, it doesn't matter if you're from Canada or not. It's up to you. Just, I realized that
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
in person, it was easy. You could just walk up and say hi, you know, and here it's this constant Zoomy thing. And I got my cat in the background who's really thrilled by all this. You can tell. Slept through the whole thing, but that's, he's not into IT.
no. Now, just one thing, I did record this. I am recording this session. It's funny, Jim dropped off now, but he happened to point out, are you recording this session? And I'm like, oh crap.
Well, he's in the
Oh,
States. He doesn't care. He's legally liable.
Yeah, so I will get it posted. It's quite a ways into Rasmus's session, but I'm hoping he was able to record some of his own session and things like that. So hopefully he'll have that one for his full thing. I'm sure we can get slides from him or any other information. He's pretty open. So, but once this one is done, I'll see how Cassandra wants to do it on the community hub. Maybe they have a place they can host it or whatever.
Yeah.
If not, we have some technologies here where we can host it. I can create a link and expire the link after so many days, send it out to people.
Yeah, we could also discuss about what, you know, if anyone, what they would want to see in the future too, for this group.
Yeah,
Obviously
definitely.
obviously in the future, we'd want to, depending on where you're located geographically, want to have in person. But you know, we don't know when that's going to happen. I don't want to guess anymore. Because that seems to jinx it. If I say, yeah, next week, then we'll all be locked down again.
No, I'm waiting for 2022 before I go.
Yeah,
to
I think that's
anything, so
the year we're reborn.
yep. So okay, well, if nobody has any questions or anything like that, then thank you so much for attending.
Yep.
Be sure to fill out the survey because one lucky person's going to be drawn and win some swag from Beam. I don't know exactly what it is. We'll have to see, but hopefully it's some pretty nice stuff from them. So
Thanks a lot, guys. And we'll see you next time, hopefully in person.
yeah, for sure. So I'm going to stop the recording.